We take last week's lease basics and take it to the next level. In today's Tip Tuesday, I'll share with you some of the biggest misconceptions I hear from rental property owners. I'm Jennifer Ruelens, landlord, educator, advocate, and broker of One Focus Property Management, here today to address some of the biggest lease misconceptions I hear. Unenforceable terms. What this means is you are allowed to put anything you want into a private contract in Pennsylvania. That is true. And if it's legal and there's compensation and the basic rules of business contract law are followed, it's enforceable. But that's not always true with leases and several other things, but leases especially. Leases have a set of rules in our Pennsylvania Landlord Tenant Code and statutory law that restrict some of these more extreme situations. So I've seen late fees be very high, for instance, $10 to $20 a day. That can be a lot. The problem is when you put those things in your lease, although both parties have agreed to it, if the tenant or landlord doesn't agree to do those things and a landlord-tenant complaint is filed, the judge has to decide whether it's enforceable or not. So I have seen things in leases not get enforced by judges simply because they don't believe that they're enforceable. So how do you avoid this? Well, you have a good quality lease that is reviewed by a real estate attorney in your state. They will help ward you off several of these things that are unenforceable. Lack of enforceable terms. What I mean by that is the consequences to non-compliance aren't in the lease. And so when you go to a judge to help enforce your lease contract, you're asking for the judge to tell the tenant what they need to do. And that's all well and good when it's not money-based, right? So maybe it's removing the animal they're not permitted to have, keeping nicer housekeeping, maybe not having tenants that they're not supposed to have in there that aren't on the lease. So maybe it's all of those things. The problem is you need to have some consequences for non-compliance, and typically they're financial fines. These are the sorts of things that judges like because there's something in the contract that they can then enforce and give you judgment for. So I encourage you to be reasonable, work with your attorney to come up with what's right, but make sure there's enforceable terms on all of your expectations and all aspects of your agreement in the lease. I hear rental property owners brag about their 1 or 2 page leases, and simple is wonderful. In fact, it's a requirement in Pennsylvania that your lease contract be in plain language, which has different requirements, grammatical, sentence length, and vocab type. The attorney you work with will be aware of that. So we do want it to be in plain language, and we do want it to be simple, and we don't want it to be too long or overly cumbersome. But we also want all aspects of our agreement covered in that lease. So if you have expectations around the lawn care, the snow removal, animals in the home, animals outside the home, different areas of the property that are restricted or available on the lease, all of those things should be detailed in the lease. A complete lease is not a bad thing, even if it's more than 2 pages. One really common misconception that I hear from rental property owners is that they say, well, I rented this property several years ago on a 1-year lease. That lease has since expired. There is no lease. It's a month-to-month lease. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's not. Here's what you need to know. Your lease should specifically address what happens at the end of the term. So if you want that lease to terminate at the end of the term and require any stay of the tenant beyond the end of the lease to be redocumented on a new lease, you can do that. But if that lease says that it terminates at its end and does not address how it renews, and the tenant continues to pay you rent, you continue to take it and continue to provide the housing service, that lease is assumed to have renewed through what's called performance. It is my highest recommendation in your leases that no matter what term you decide to initially rent for, that you define the end of the lease as reverting to month-to-month terms at its completion. Now that doesn't mean you can't renew the lease. It doesn't mean you can't change that lease. What it means is if you miss that end of the lease, you won't be roped into an additional year through any sort of inaction. In Pennsylvania, when a property is sold, leases do what's called run with the land. And what that means is the lease stays in effect. The only thing that changes is who owns the property, who's getting paid the rent, and who owes those housing service responsibilities to the tenant. So if I buy a property and there's a lease on it, I am now obligated to act as that landlord under that lease. So if there's 6 more months on that lease, I'm stuck with it. But I can renegotiate that lease when it's up. Now, maybe that lease is in month-to-month terms. When I purchase the property, I can then give notice of 30 days to change the lease to the tenant and get that lease renewed and renegotiated. When a property is sold, it does not mean that the lease is terminated, canceled, or that the tenant has to move out. That is a misconception, and I hope to clear that up today. When the lease signed is really up to you, but here's a couple of things in the order of events that you should remember. So when a tenant applies with you, so they provide their personal information for you to provide the necessary background checks to decide whether you're going to rent to them, the lease should be provided to the tenant to renew at that, or to review at that time. It's important that they know what they're getting into. It would be wrong to expect a tenant to pay an application fee or a security deposit for a property without having the opportunity to review the lease requirements that come with your property. So, in the application process, they should get to view it. Once the application has been approved, you should present the lease to the tenant and attempt to get that signed, as well as collect the security deposit. Once the lease is completely executed by all leaseholders, co-signers, and the landlord, and the deposit is paid, you can move forward to move-in day. You would want your move-in rent paid and then provide the keys. It is important that the tenant get to review that lease prior to applying, that the lease is signed and deposit is paid before they move in, and that no keys are issued until money is paid and that lease is signed. That's the proper order of events. If you decide not to follow that, that's fine and totally your decision. You just open yourself up to a lot more risk of losing financially. That's the best I have to offer on leases. Don't miss last week's video. Part 1 was great. And don't miss next week's video. You will if you don't hit subscribe. So if you hit subscribe, you'll make sure to see our videos every single week. Let me know what you want to know more about.